Red wine poured slowly down Mara Quinn's hair while 5 drunk men laughed without restraint, and not a single soul in the packed dining room dared to look up, not the guests at nearby tables, not the bartender gripping the counter, not even the manager standing 20 feet away. Only Caleb Rourke, a quiet single father seated at the far end of the bar, reached forward and set his glass down without a word. 10 seconds later, all 5 men were on the floor, none of them badly hurt, none of them able to stand. But when the police arrived, Mara had disappeared, the cameras had been wiped clean, and Caleb was placed in handcuffs for something he never did that night. If you believe courage can wake justice from its long silence, stay with this story until the very end. The Gilded Laurel sat on the edge of Charleston's historic waterfront, the kind of restaurant where reservations were made weeks in advance, and every bottle of wine cost more than most people's grocery budgets. On a rainy Tuesday evening in November, a maintenance van pulled quietly into the service lot behind the building, and Caleb Rourke stepped out with a toolbox and the unhurried confidence of a man who had been inside dozens of kitchens just like this one. His job that night was a routine inspection of the cooling system in the wine cellar, a task contracted through the building's property management company, not through the restaurant itself, which was a small distinction that would later matter more than he realized. He was 41 years old, broad-shouldered and composed, with the kind of stillness in his face that people often mistook for indifference. Caleb had not been indifferent for a long time. He had simply learned that the cost of caring too loudly was higher than most people were willing to pay. He finished the inspection earlier than expected, a misaligned refrigerant valve, nothing more, and because the rain outside had thickened into a proper storm, he carried his toolbox to the far end of the bar and ordered a club soda. His phone buzzed once while he waited, and it was Lena, his 15-year-old daughter, calling from her aunt's house across town where she stayed during the school week. The call lasted 3 minutes. She asked whether he would make it to her recital on Saturday, and he told her without hesitation that he would be there. After she hung up, he sat holding the phone a moment longer than necessary, the way a man does when he knows the one thing he cannot afford to lose and wants to be sure it is still close. The restaurant was full but not chaotic. Well-dressed couples at candlelit tables, a birthday gathering near the window, a sommelier moving between the aisles with the practiced calm of someone who had memorized the floor plan. Caleb noticed the waitress because she was good at her job and careful in a way that did not match the simplicity of carrying plates and pouring wine. Her name tag read Mara, and she moved through the room with deliberate efficiency, but once every few minutes she glanced toward the manager's office near the back hall. A quick, furtive look, the kind you give a door you are waiting to open before anyone notices you standing in front of it. 5 men entered the restaurant at 8:45, led by a broad man in a charcoal blazer who walked with the entitlement of someone accustomed to being accommodated. They were dressed in expensive clothes and smelled of whiskey already consumed elsewhere, and when they settled into a corner booth, they did not look at the menu so much as at the staff, assessing how much they could demand before anyone pushed back. The manager, Dean Holloway, came out immediately, not to manage the situation but to smooth it, nodding too eagerly, waving the other servers away from the table with a small hand gesture that no one was supposed to notice. Dean's manner toward the group was not the deference of someone managing difficult guests. It was the careful ease of someone greeting men he already knew. The broad man's name was Mason Pike, and he called Mara to the table himself, rather than flagging any of the other servers. He leaned forward when she arrived and asked her in a low voice whether she had found what did not belong to her, his tone almost friendly, the way a threat sounds when the person making it has made many threats before and no longer feels the need to raise his voice. Mara's expression did not change, but the tray she held shifted slightly in her grip, and Caleb, watching from 30 feet away, saw her hand tighten around the metal edge with the controlled steadiness of someone managing something much larger than a tray. What he noticed next he could not have explained entirely in words. Below the cuff of Mara's sleeve, where a watch band should have been, there was a small rectangular shape beneath the fabric, slight, the size of a data card, pressed flat against her wrist and held there. He did not know what it contained, but what he understood, with the quiet certainty of a man who had spent years reading rooms for a living, was that this exchange was not a dispute between a drunk customer and a waitress. It was a demand, and the woman holding the tray had not come to this restaurant by accident. Mason picked up his wine glass and turned it slowly in his hand, watching Mara's face with the patient expression of a man who had already decided what he was going to do. He asked her, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear, whether she wanted to hand it over herself or preferred the whole room to watch what happened next, and then he tilted the glass forward and the red wine fell in a long arc across Mara Quinn's face and hair. The wine was dark and cold and soaked through her collar and ran down the white fabric of her uniform while the 4 men at the table burst into laughter. Loud and unself-conscious, the laughter of people who had never been told it would cost them anything. No one at the nearby tables stood up, several guests found sudden interest in their plates, and the bartender took a half-step back as though he had felt a change in pressure. Mara Quinn did not cry. She stood completely still for 2 seconds, with wine dripping from her jaw, and the way she held herself told Caleb everything he needed to know about how long she had been carrying something she could not put down. He stood up from the bar without announcing it, crossed the room in a straight line, reached the table and handed Mara a clean cloth napkin from a nearby setting. He told her quietly to step aside, then turned to Mason Pike and said in an even voice that he expected an apology followed by the departure of all 5 men from the building. Mason stared at him for a long moment, the way men do when they are deciding whether the person in front of them is worth taking seriously, and then he smiled. He said the name Caleb Rourke, the way someone says a name they looked up before they arrived, with the flatness of a rehearsed line, mentioned an assignment from 8 years ago, and called Caleb the kind of man who walked away when clients needed him most, the kind of professional failure that tended to follow a person for the rest of their life. The specificity of it confirmed what Caleb had already suspected. These men had not wandered in. They had come to this restaurant with a purpose, and someone had given them a file. Caleb kept his voice level and told Mason that if any of them touched Mara again, they would regret it before they could form a plan about it. Mason pushed him in the shoulder, a slow, deliberate shove meant to establish physics, and one of the others began circling behind, while 2 more shifted toward the aisle where Mara had stepped back. What followed lasted approximately 10 seconds. And in those 10 seconds nothing that happened could accurately be called a fight. Caleb moved first toward the man coming up behind him, not to engage him but to use his momentum, letting the lunge carry him sideways into the man beside him so they tangled together against the wall. He stepped onto the edge of the service cart and angled it hard across the aisle, cutting off the 2 men moving toward Mara and giving her an opening to the side hall. Mason swung and Caleb was no longer in front of him, already beside him, driving Mason's wrist down flat against the tabletop with a two-handed lock that bent the joint to the precise edge of pain without crossing it. The fifth man's shoe found the wine already pooled on the polished floor, and he went down on his own with a crash of glassware and a great deal of noise. Two men on the floor, two pinned against the overturned cart. Mason locked with his wrist on the table and unable to get leverage. The whole sequence had the compressed economy of someone who had trained for years to end situations rather than prolong them. Caleb stepped back, held his hands open, and told Dean Holloway to call the police and instruct every employee to stay exactly where they were and not touch the room. Dean nodded and walked toward the phone and past the panel behind the host station and, with one practiced motion, switched off the restaurant's camera system. When Caleb turned to look for Mara Quinn, the space where she had been standing was empty. On the side table near the hall she had come through, there was a wine-stained napkin folded once, and beneath it a narrow strip of paper on which someone had written in quick, careful letters, "Do not trust the manager. They came because of me." The first officer through the door had received a call about a customer assault, and the story waiting for him was already assembled and consistent. Dean Holloway told him that a man at the bar had attacked 5 guests without provocation, a sudden explosion of violence completely unpredictable. Mason Pike and the other 4 gave their statements separately, but with the same rhythm and vocabulary, the kind of matching detail that does not happen when witnesses recall events naturally and independently. The camera system, Dean explained, had been undergoing a routine software update since early that evening, which was why there was no footage. A guest at a nearby table had captured a short clip on a personal device, but it began only after the altercation was over, showing Caleb standing upright above 5 prone figures, without the preceding 30 seconds that would have explained how the situation began. Mara Quinn's belongings had been cleared from the staff locker room, her employment file resolved to a name and address that did not match any existing records in the city, and she had apparently worked at the Gilded Laurel for 6 months without ever fully existing on paper. Detective Rowan Cade arrived 40 minutes later, and Caleb recognized him the way you recognize someone whose face you have tried not to think about. Rowan had been part of the investigation team that processed the report leading to Caleb's dismissal 8 years earlier. The detective said nothing personal in the first exchange, only that Gideon Wycliffe's private attorneys had already called the precinct to represent the 5 men, and that a senior executive taking personal interest in a bar dispute at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night was the kind of detail he found difficult to explain away. Caleb was held for questioning, answered every question directly, described exactly what he saw and what he did, and declined to speculate on the identities or purposes of the 5 men because he did not know enough yet to speak accurately. Sometime after midnight, Gideon Wycliffe appeared at the precinct in a dark suit, calm as a man attending a board meeting, and sat down across the table from Caleb. He explained without preamble that the situation could be simplified considerably. If Caleb signed a brief statement acknowledging that his actions that evening had resulted from an inability to manage the stress of his personal circumstances, the 5 guests would withdraw all complaints, and Caleb could return home before morning. Caleb understood the architecture of what was being offered. A signed statement of personal instability would not only close the current case, but would become permanent evidence confirming the narrative that had destroyed his career 8 years ago. The story of a man who could not be trusted to hold his position when something went wrong. He told Gideon Wycliffe that he would not be signing anything, and the conversation ended. An elderly woman had sent the precinct a voice recording from her personal phone captured earlier that evening, before the altercation began, in which Mason Pike's voice was audible asking Mara about something she was concealing in a tone that made clear the question was not a request. It was not sufficient to charge anyone that night, but it was sufficient to establish that Caleb had not manufactured a pretext for violence, and he was released before 2 in the morning. He returned to his apartment 2 blocks from the harbor, and the door was closed and the lock had not been forced, but every drawer in every room had been pulled open and searched. And the only thing on the kitchen table that did not belong there was a manila folder containing the full case file from the incident 8 years ago. The report that had ended his career, kept in a locked steel box in the back of the closet, which was no longer in the closet. His second phone, the prepaid one he used for contractors, began to ring on the counter. He answered it, and a woman's voice said, "My father was the man you weren't able to protect 8 years ago." She named a laundromat on a side street near the freight rail corridor, a place that closed at 10, but whose back room stayed accessible through a service door that had not latched properly since the previous winter. Caleb arrived first and stood near the folding tables in the half-dark, while rain moved across the window glass. Mara Quinn came in from the alley door 14 minutes later, her hair still faintly stained at the edges, and she apologized for leaving the restaurant without waiting for the police. Not the way someone asks forgiveness, but the way someone explains a calculation. When the altercation ended, she had seen Dean Holloway moving through the crowd toward the staff area where her bag was stored, and she had understood that she had perhaps 45 seconds before he reached it, and 6 months of documentation was inside that bag. Her father, Elias Quinn, had served as chief auditor for Carrington Crown Hospitality for 11 years, thorough and methodical, a man who had spent the last 18 months of his life building a case around a pattern he first noticed in the quarterly reconciliation reports. A steady flow of funds had been leaving the employee pension and payroll reserves through a web of contracts with security and logistics vendors that did not provide services commensurate with what they were paid, and the vendors traced back to a holding company called Wycliffe Strategic Protection. The funds involved amounted to tens of millions of dollars removed over several years from accounts that bore the wages and retirement savings of hundreds of employees. Elias had been scheduled to present his findings to the board, and 3 days before the meeting his car left the road on a wet, elevated highway and struck a barrier at low speed. The official determination was driver fatigue, and there was nothing technically wrong with the finding, but Elias had prepared for the possibility that something might happen before he could speak, and he had left pieces of what he knew in places where someone with enough reason to look might eventually find them. Caleb listened without interrupting. When Mara explained the assignment 8 years prior, that Caleb had been contracted to protect Elias during the days leading up to the board presentation, that he had been called away from his post by an emergency directive bearing valid electronic credentials, that when he followed the directive and arrived at the reassigned location, there was no emergency and no explanation, and that his company had subsequently claimed the directive had never been issued. He did not offer a reaction. He had lived with the shape of that story for a very long time. What he did not know, and what Mara now placed on the folding table in front of him, was a printed copy of the original order, and the authentication code embedded in the directive resolved to a server address registered to the executive offices of Carrington Crown Hospitality, specifically to a terminal within the suite occupied by Chief Operating Officer Gideon Wycliffe. Caleb looked at it for a long time and told her he was not sure he could continue being involved, that he had a daughter and a contract business and a record that was already fragile, and that what she was describing was not a problem that ended cleanly. Mara told him she understood and did not try to change his mind. She simply slid the printout across the table toward him and left it there. A car engine stopped in the alley outside, and Mara crossed to the window and looked at the vehicle idling in the dark, reading the plates once and then again. She turned from the glass and said quietly that the woman in the car was Vivienne Carrington. Vivienne Carrington entered with a lawyer on her left and a security contractor on her right, and she moved through the laundromat door with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent her entire adult life in rooms where she was the most important person present. She was 39 years old, composed and precise, and she had driven herself to this location rather than sending anyone, because she was still deciding how much of this she was willing to let become a record. She did not threaten Caleb or Mara. She told them, with the measured formality of an executive addressing a legal matter, that the data Mara had accessed belonged to Carrington Crown Hospitality, that its removal from the company's systems constituted unauthorized extraction of proprietary information, and that she was prepared to handle the situation privately if both parties cooperated with an internal review. Mara told Vivian she had been inside that restaurant for 6 months and had watched senior management take direction from people her father had died trying to expose, and Vivian's expression tightened at the mention of Elias Quinn. Not with guilt but with surprise. The kind a person shows when they hear a name they were told had resolved into something much simpler than this. Mara showed Vivienne a partial set of transaction records on a tablet screen. Transfers from the pension reserves into accounts held by Wycliffe Strategic Protection spanning a period of 4 years. Vivienne looked at the numbers for a long moment and then asked to see authorization signatures, and when Mara scrolled to them, Vivienne's lawyer put a hand on her arm, but Vivienne moved the hand away and leaned closer. Her own name appeared on the authorizations, her signature, replicated digitally and applied to transactions she had never reviewed, on dates when she had been traveling internationally and would not have had access to the relevant internal systems. Caleb told her that a signature executed on a day its supposed author was in a different country was not a signature, and that someone with administrative credentials at the executive level had made the approvals appear legitimate. Vivienne asked what they needed. Caleb told her they needed access to the wine cellar at the Gilded Laurel, where Elias Quinn had reportedly secured the primary evidence before his death, and that what he was asking was not for her to arrange access. He was asking whether she would keep everything she had just heard away from her internal counsel for 24 hours, because if a member of her legal team reached the cellar first, the evidence would disappear before morning in the same way Mara's employment file had disappeared. Vivienne considered this for a moment that lasted longer than Caleb expected, then agreed to 24 hours of silence on the condition that if they found what Elias had left, she would be the first to see it. She turned toward the door, and then her phone lit up with a call from her office, and what she heard changed the set of her face from controlled deliberation to something closer to contained anger. The board had received an anonymous briefing delivered through a media contact who specialized in corporate crisis coverage, identifying Caleb Rourke as a former security professional with a documented history of violence, who was now exploiting a minor restaurant incident to pursue a personal grievance. A video clip, the same 30-second fragment from the dining room, stripped of all context, had been circulating widely enough to reach national news coverage within hours. Gideon Wickliffe had not waited for them to find the evidence. He had begun dismantling Caleb's credibility before there was anything left to counter it with. They reached the restaurant at 4 in the morning. Moving through the service entrance on the south side of the building, where the loading dock connected to a utility corridor, Caleb had walked twice during the refrigerant inspection. The corridor was not on the restaurant's posted floor plan. It had been part of the original building structure before the dining room was expanded, and the management company had never formally incorporated it into the maintenance records. Caleb had noticed it simply because the cooling line ran through it, and because he had developed, over years of working in buildings owned by people with secrets, a habit of noticing spaces that did not appear on official drawings. The tension between them had not dissolved, but it had shifted into something less combative, and moving through a dark corridor toward the same uncertain destination tends to produce a kind of involuntary honesty between people. Mara admitted that she had hated him for a long time, not abstractly, but with the specific and sustaining force of someone who needed a face to put on a loss that had no other face. She said that watching him hand her a napkin and stand in front of 5 men without waiting to be asked had made her unsure for the first time of the story she had been holding. Caleb told her without sentiment that after Elias died he had lost his job and his reputation and eventually his marriage, and that he had spent 8 years maintaining the fiction that keeping his head down would protect his daughter from the fallout of something he had not done. He was not telling her this to ask for anything. He was telling her because she deserved the full accounting. The wine cellar was long and cool, and arranged with the seriousness of a room that took its own purpose considerably more important than a storage area. Mara knew which section to look in. Her father had left a letter in his apartment, found 2 years after his death, saying he had hidden something in the last consignment he personally catalogued, and that she would recognize his method when she saw it. They worked through the rack systematically until Mara found a bottle of aged Bordeaux with its label applied at a slight angle. Not damaged, not accidental, deliberately placed by a man who signed his name to things with great precision. Beneath the label, secured in the gap between the glass and the foil, was a small steel key. The key opened a locked panel flush behind the rack's support frame, a narrow steel enclosure bolted to the original stone wall, and inside were 3 items. A bound ledger with handwritten annotations in a style Mara recognized immediately, a sealed envelope containing photocopied transaction records, and a small digital recorder that was old enough to require a specific battery type but had been stored with a fresh set. Mara pressed play with both hands steady, and the voice that came from the recorder was her father's, quieter than she remembered, more tired, but precise in the way that all of Elias Quinn's speech had been precise. He named Gideon Wickliffe, named the mechanism of the theft, named the years, and stated that the operation had been running with the assistance of someone inside the company's legal division, who had the authority to execute transactions under a replicated executive signature. He was beginning to name that person when the lights in the wine cellar went out entirely. Caleb pulled Mara back from the panel, closed it, and Dean Holloway's voice came from the stairwell alongside the sound of two other sets of footsteps. Dean said with the flat satisfaction of a man who had been waiting for this moment that the storage access sensors had sent an alert directly to his phone and that he had been awake for precisely this occasion. Caleb located the emergency refrigerant shutoff on the wall, triggered the cold air alarm that vented through the cellar and filled the room with noise and low pressure, and used the disorientation to guide Mara through the utility passage and up to the loading dock. In the confusion, the ledger slipped from her arm and fell, and Dean caught it before it reached the floor, but the recorder was already in her jacket pocket and they were outside. Vivian called as they reached the parking lot, and she said the company's lead attorney had gone unreachable 2 hours earlier and had taken the complete board meeting documentation with her. Her name was Evelyn Wycliffe, Gideon's younger sister. Vivian's legal team reviewed the recording in a downtown office before 7 in the morning and came back with a finding that was technically precise and practically devastating. The device was old, the chain of custody was non-existent, and any competent opposing attorney would file an authenticity challenge before the evidence could be formally entered. The recording was real and they all knew it was real. But knowing and proving are separated by exactly the distance that skilled lawyers learn to exploit. Mara's digital records, the 6 months of documentation assembled at personal risk, had been preemptively designated as stolen proprietary data by a public statement Gideon's team had released overnight. The ledger was in Dean Holloway's possession, and the transaction records in the sealed envelope remained inside the cellar panel under active security monitoring. The media coverage of Caleb continued to compound through the morning, with 2 former associates from his security career providing brief on-record statements characterizing him as volatile and difficult to manage, and these were being appended to every article about the restaurant incident. The maintenance company called before noon and suspended his contract pending resolution of the public situation because they could not afford the association. Caleb accepted this without argument. He had made his peace with losing things by necessity many times before. Lena called in the early afternoon, and she did not ask whether the things people were saying about him were true. She was 15, and she knew her father, but the quality of her voice told him the world was being unkind in her direction, and he told her to go back to school and that he would explain everything on Saturday and that nothing had changed between them. After the call ended, he sat without moving for several minutes, and then he found Mara in the next room and told her he was removing himself from the situation, that she needed someone with different resources and a cleaner record, and that he was sorry he could not be more useful. Mara told him she understood. She was not angry. She had already accepted the possibility of doing this alone, and that acceptance was visible in the steadiness with which she received what he said. Vivian's access to her own company systems was formally suspended by the board's executive committee that afternoon, and Gideon Wycliffe was scheduled to be named interim chief executive at the Carrington family's annual dinner gala the following evening, an event hosted in the ballroom of the Carrington Grand Hotel and attended by board members, major investors, regional press, and several city officials who owed their careers to the Wycliffe family's long reach. Detective Rowan Cade found Caleb at a diner near the waterfront and slid into the booth across from him without being invited. He had pulled the original directive from 8 years ago through a channel that did not officially exist, and the server routing confirmed what the authentication code had already indicated. The order had originated within the Wycliffe network, sent from a device registered to Gideon's office suite. Rowan told him that Mara was planning to attend the gala that evening and deliver the recording before the full board, and that if she arrived without verified corroborating evidence, Gideon would have her removed and charged, and the recorder would not survive the encounter. Then Rowan leaned forward and said there was one more thing. The camera system at the Gilded Laurel had not been fully deactivated on the night of the incident. The network had been interrupted at the local level, but the footage had already been pushed to an off-site backup server. A cloud redundancy protocol Dean Holloway had not known existed because it had been installed 3 weeks earlier as part of a corporate security upgrade ordered by Vivienne herself. That server was housed in the IT infrastructure center located in the lower level of the Carrington Grand Hotel. The Carrington Grand occupied a full city block downtown, and on the night of the gala, it was lit from the ground to the roofline with warm amber light that made the building look like something built before living memory and intended to outlast everyone inside it. Guests arrived in a steady procession. Board members with their families, investors who had held Carrington Crown stock for decades, journalists covering the transfer of power with the practiced neutrality of people who had already decided which way the story went, and local officials who attended every event of this kind because being present when power changed hands was itself a form of currency. Gideon Wycliffe moved through the pre-dinner reception with the easy sociability of a man who had spent 30 years making rooms feel like they belonged to him, and he looked across the crowd with the measured patience of someone watching the last few minutes of a game he had already won. Vivienne arrived on time and greeted people with a warmth that concealed nothing because she had spent the day making sure there was nothing left to conceal from herself. She had instructed her personal assistant to hold all communications from the board's executive committee to prepare the main ballroom's presentation system for an external video input, and to do both of these things without logging them in the official event record. Mara entered through the service entrance on a staff credential that had never technically been deactivated, an administrative oversight so routine in a company of this size that no one would have thought to check for it. Caleb came in through the lower level, through the mechanical access corridor where the hotel's cooling plant was housed, a space he could navigate not because he had studied the building's plans, but because all large hotel mechanical rooms follow the same fundamental logic, and he had been inside enough of them to read the layout from the equipment alone. He found the IT infrastructure room on the second sublevel, identified the backup server cluster from the network label and camera brand identifier, and pulled the archived footage from the relevant date and time on a drive Rowan had ensured was formatted and waiting. Dean found Mara in the main level corridor before she reached the ballroom and guided her toward a private event room on the east side of the floor. Not threatening, just steering. The way you steer someone when you want to keep them moving in a direction they are not fully choosing. He locked the door behind them, took the recorder from her bag with practiced efficiency, and called Gideon. Mason Pike and 2 contractors intercepted Caleb in the service hallway between the mechanical room and the elevator bank, and Mason explained that there were cameras in the hallway, and that this would be a very good time for Caleb to do something that could be added to the footage. Caleb pulled the fire suppression release above the nearest sprinkler head, which activated the corridor's wet system and the building's fire alarm protocol simultaneously, and the automated fire doors sealed the hallway into 3 sections. The noise and the water and the door closures separated Mason from the other 2, and Caleb put Mason into a joint lock against the wall and held him there for exactly as long as it took to remove the key card from his jacket pocket and walk him to where Rowan Cade and 4 officers were already moving through the building's service entrance on the authority of an emergency data access warrant. Caleb used the key card to reach the ballroom level and handed the backup drive to Vivienne's assistant 90 seconds before Gideon was scheduled to take the podium. The footage played on the main screen while the room was still settling, complete and clear and unambiguous. Mason Pike at the corner booth, the wine glass tilting forward, the arc of red wine, the laughter, the escalating demand, and Mason's voice captured by the room's ambient microphone, saying that his employer wanted the storage device retrieved before midnight. Gideon watched the screen from across the room with the stillness of a man calculating exits, and when the footage ended he began to speak calmly, explaining that Mason had acted independently and invoked Gideon's name without authorization, and that the footage proved nothing about the company's finances or his own conduct. Then he reached into his jacket, held the digital recorder briefly over his champagne glass, and dropped it. The device hit the ballroom floor and broke into several pieces beneath the heel of his shoe. The room went quiet with the specific quality of quiet that follows an act of deliberate destruction in a public space. Not shocked exactly, but recalibrating. Gideon straightened his jacket and looked at the board members with the patient expression of a man who had just demonstrated that he controlled the situation, and he was wrong about this for the first time in a very long time. Mara Quinn stepped through the ballroom's side door and walked to the front of the room, and what she held up was not the recorder. It was Caleb's phone, its screen showing a waveform frozen at the beginning of a playback file. She explained, in the unhurried voice of someone who had prepared for exactly this contingency, that she had transferred the full recording to Caleb's device in the parking lot of the laundromat. On the night they left the wine cellar, because the recorder was old and the situation was uncertain, and she had decided on the morning she applied for work at the Gilded Laurel that she would not allow her father's last words to exist in only one place. Vivienne took the phone and connected it to the room's audio system. The recording played from the beginning, Elias Quinn's voice, unhurried and precise, naming Gideon Wycliffe, naming the mechanism, naming the years, and the portion that had been cut short in the cellar continued now to the end. At the end, Elias stated clearly that the individual within the company's legal division responsible for executing the forged authorizations was Evelyn Wycliffe, acting with her brother's direction and her own administrative credentials. Detective Rowan Cade presented the server data confirming the chain of transfers from the employee funds directly to Wycliffe Strategic Protection. Data verified by the Federal Financial Crimes Unit he had quietly contacted 48 hours earlier without informing his captain. Mason Pike moved toward the ballroom's rear exit and was perhaps 20 feet from the door when Caleb stepped into the corridor in front of him, held Mason's wrist for 3 seconds, and walked him back to where the officers were waiting. Vivienne faced the full assembly and said that she had placed her trust in systems she had not looked at closely enough and in counsel she had not questioned rigorously enough, and that the people most harmed by this The employees whose wages and retirement savings had been taken while she signed documents without reading what she was authorizing deserved something more than an institutional acknowledgement. She cast her family's full voting interest against Gideon's appointment, called for an emergency board session, and announced that she was turning over the complete financial record to the federal agency that had been waiting in a conference room on the hotel's fourth floor for the past 6 hours. Gideon Wycliffe, Evelyn Wycliffe, Dean Holloway, and Mason Pike were detained that evening on charges including financial fraud, obstruction, witness intimidation, and falsification of legal records. The charges against Caleb Rourke from the night of the restaurant incident were formally withdrawn before midnight, and a review of the 8-year-old case file was opened the following week. Mara found Caleb near the ballroom service exit, standing with his jacket over his arm and his hands in his pockets, looking at nothing in particular with the steady, unremarkable expression of a man who had done what needed to be done and was now deciding what came next. She asked him why he had not struck Gideon when he had every reason to. Caleb considered this honestly and said that 10 seconds was sufficient to stop a punch, but that standing long enough to outlast a lie required a different kind of endurance entirely. 3 months later, Gideon Wycliffe was formally indicted on 6 counts of financial fraud and 2 counts of obstruction of justice, and the proceedings were expected to take the better part of 2 years, which was the pace at which the truth tended to move when the people hiding it had spent a decade building walls around it. Caleb's name was cleared in the old case file, and the correction entered into the official record with the thoroughness he had long stopped hoping for. He did not return to the personal protection industry. Instead, he opened a small consulting firm that trained restaurant and hospitality staff in de-escalation, conflict containment, and the protection of workers who reported problems to management and found that management was the problem. Vivian reorganized Carrington Crown Hospitality from the board level downward, establishing an independent employee advocacy division with genuine authority over grievance and financial auditing, and initiated a full repayment program for the workers whose pension and payroll funds had been diverted over 6 years. Structured without conditions and without publicity, because Vivienne had learned that the opposite of exploitation was not a press release. Mara Quinn completed the accounting program she had left unfinished in the year her father died and accepted a position as Senior Labor Compliance Officer with the reorganized company. A role offered not out of sentiment, but because she had demonstrated, over 6 months of personal risk, exactly the kind of scrutiny the position required. On a Thursday evening in late spring, Caleb brought Lena to the Gilded Laurel for dinner, the first time she had been there, and she looked at everything with the frank curiosity of someone filing the details away. Mara brought them a bottle of sparkling grape juice and said with a straight face that no one was allowed to spill anything that evening. Lena laughed and excused herself to take a call in the lobby, the way teenagers create private space from their parents in plain sight, and in the quiet that followed, Mara asked Caleb whether he had any regrets about the night he stood up from the bar. He looked across the room toward the corner booth where the wine glass had been tilted, the floor had been stained, and 5 men had decided they were untouchable. He said the only thing he regretted was believing for too many years that staying quiet could keep the people he loved out of harm's reach. Mara set her hand on the table near his, close but unhurried, in no particular rush to cross the remaining distance. Caleb set his glass down on the white tablecloth, The same quiet, deliberate motion as the night everything began, and this time he stood up not toward a fight, but to walk out with the two of them into an evening that was finally, after a very long time, entirely his own.